Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar today. We're happy to host the next in our series for Hot Talks. So today's topic is sanctuary and deportation, and we're just pleased to welcome our presenters today. I will do a first introduction, but again, we're on Facebook Live, so if anybody on there has any questions for us, you're welcome to type those in so we can include those in the Q&A that will follow. So there'll be some brief remarks, and then we'll jump right to a Q&A so you can ask your questions of our presenters today as well. I want to welcome Jennifer Kern, who will be moderating the conversation today. She is the Director of Communications for the law firm of Corman, Jackson, and France. She has a great background in journalism as former editor of Inside Business, writing, freelance, so it's a great kind of research and insight that she'll bring to her moderating as well. So Jennifer, if you'd like to come up, I'll let you introduce our other speakers today, and we'll get underway.
Good morning. I am also a longtime member of the Press Club of Cleveland's board, and I just want to mention how happy we are to have this partnership, this programming partnership with the Cleveland Metropolitan Bar Association. I'm really thrilled to be here on behalf of the Press Club. As was mentioned, Hot Talks, if you've been here before, these are conversations, not speeches, so please, you'll have an opportunity about halfway through to chime in with comments and questions. And as was mentioned, we're also streaming live on Facebook, and you'll be moderating comments. We can incorporate those into the question and answer period as well. If you're posting to social media, I would greatly appreciate it if you would use the handle @PressClubClee and @Clee Metro Bar as well. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today on this important topic. The Reverend Dr. John C. Lentz Jr., right here directly to my right, is the pastor and head of staff of Forest Hills Presbyterian Church in Cleveland Heights. Reverend Lentz was born in Arlington, Virginia, and grew up in the DC area during the civil rights years. He earned a history degree from Kenyon College, has a Master's of Divinity degree from the Yale University Divinity School. He also received his master's in theology and a PhD from the New College at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Pastor Lentz has been engaged in social action and justice throughout his ministry, and obviously we're going to talk today quite extensively about his work in the matter of immigration, sanctuaries, and deportation. To his right, Michael Sangiacomo has been a reporter since 1972. He worked full-time at a suburban Philadelphia newspaper while attending Temple University. He's been a general assignment reporter at the Plain Dealer since 1989, which means he does a little bit of everything, ranging from cops, features, investigations, movie and comic reviews, and he's a comic book writer as well, and pretty much everything but sports. And he's been doing quite a bit of reporting recently about immigration. Coming back to immigration from covering the issue back in what you call the more civilized 1990s. So Pastor Lentz is going to kick off our conversation first, and he comes to this issue with a very personal connection. On September 15th, he granted sanctuary for the undocumented immigrant by the name of Leonor Garcia. She is still there at the church. She's lived in the United States for 20 years and has 4 American-born children. It's a case that's received national media attention. And Michael, also, if you've seen his reporting in the Plain Dealer, he has a piece in today's issue about a woman who will most likely be deported today. And she would be separated from her 3 American-born children, including one that has cerebral palsy and relies on a wheelchair. So I will first introduce to you Pastor John Lentz.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a great privilege to be before you, to have this opportunity. And I just want you to be mindful, as I am mindful, that we sit in the warmth of this place and our freedom to discuss topics of great interest. I want you to remember the name Fabiola Hernandez, who is the woman with 6-year-old twins, one who has cerebral palsy. She's about to be deported. She's being forced to leave for American-born children to take them to a place that has little or no support system for children of these special needs, or to leave them here. You can read Mike's article in the Plain Dealer this morning. We're discussing today more than an academic issue. This is affecting real people, and I only wish that Lenore and Fabiola had the freedom to come and speak to you about their own story instead of having me come and try to represent them. And also to share of their experience of, in my term, the obscene hardships that Immigration and Customs Enforcement Office is placing upon them. Let me start with a story. This really happened just a few weeks ago, Monday before Thanksgiving. I led a group, about 50 others. We went to the ICE office in Bedford Heights in order to follow the process that is given to undocumented immigrants to apply for a U visa and to apply for a stay of deportation. A U visa, as probably many of you know, is a visa given to non-citizens who've been a victim of a crime and then who help law enforcement with that crime to solve the crime. Lenore Garcia, the undocumented immigrant from Mexico who is now living at Forest Hill Church, and her family is still in Akron, but they come and visit. 4 children between the ages of 4 and 20, all born in the United States of America, therefore American citizens. They have been victims of a crime, and so have a pathway to a green card and actually even citizenship to apply for. Lenore, with the help of an immigration lawyer, filled out the U visa application and turned it into the U.S. Immigration Service. Lenore received receipt of that application. She is following her due process right. Undocumented immigrants have the right to appeal, and she was following that right. So going back to this Monday before Thanksgiving, I went to that ICE office in order to give the office the receipt of this application for a U visa, as well as to apply for a stay of deportation. That is how it is done. This is Leonore's and other undocumented immigrants' due process to appeal a deportation. It is part of the United States immigration law as I understand it. What would normally happen in normal times is that the ICE officer would both accept the receipt and the application for the stay, take our $155 fee, seek confirmation from U.S. Immigration that the U visa had been applied for. Given that Leonore's U visa application should be in process, therefore there is no longer any reason for her to be on that deportation list. Leonore should have been home with her 4 children in her house, perhaps even back at work by December the 1st. However, these are not normal times. Leonore's due process was not denied after a hearing, but rejected out of hand. The process was not even allowed to begin. ICE officer Crowley said that Leonore needed to be there in person to make the application. I challenged that interpretation. I know many other instances where individuals and attorneys representing the undocumented person applies on their behalf, and the actual wording of the document or the process is, it says in person, but not necessarily the person for whom the application is intended. And certainly it is very clear that it can be interpreted also as opposed to by mail, email, or fax. When I asked Officer Crowley for written assurance that if Lenore came in person to make the application, she would not be detained, he was very clear, said no. You're a bright audience. You can see the conundrum that I am in and Lenore is in. If she had applied in person for a stay of deportation, which is her right, she would have been detained and put on the next plane to Nuevo Laredo. And you can read Mike's excellent articles about how unpleasant it is to be dropped off there. Later, ICE agents said that Lenore was a fugitive from justice and a flight risk. Lenore is no fugitive. She has been living openly at the church for 3 months, and ICE knows it. We held a public press conference, and Lenore has a GPS anklet on her so that ICE knows where she is at any moment. Lenore has never taken that anklet off. We are not harboring a criminal. but giving sanctuary to a woman who has certain due process rights that she has not been allowed to follow. And just so you know, the anklet can and has gone off at all hours of the night, and the first week that GPS anklet, first night went off at 3 a.m., and the next night went off at 4 a.m., and the third early morning it went off at 5 a.m. with flashing lights, loud noise, and a recording in Spanish about you better get to ICE office immediately. I remember the last words of Officer Crowley: Ms. Garcia made her choice, we will do what we do. Sounds to me like personal retribution, more than following the law of our great country. And the fact is that Ms. Garcia did make her choice because no other choice was given her. She was not allowed her process. We can talk about immigration reform, and we should. ICE has legitimate duties to perform, but the Trump administration's policy of rounding up all undocumented immigrants and separating families, calling them all criminals, is abusive and absurd. ICE has unchecked discretionary power over all immigrants. There is no longer any distinction between a felon and an innocent mother, and there is a huge danger when any arm of the government is unchecked. And I suspect Republican brothers and sisters, as well as Democrat brothers and sisters, would say amen to that. Women like Fabiola and Lenore are the low-hanging fruit, and your ICE agents, our ICE agents, are running around picking. Leonore was born in Mexico, a very poor village. Her father died when she was young. Her mother left the family to get to work in Mexico City. Growing up with her grandmother in poverty, the violence of the drug cartels all around, that's her context. Leonore, at 15, escaped the United States. She crossed the border without documentation. And since then, she's been a worker, a taxpayer, a homeowner, a mother, without so much as a traffic ticket. She'd even begun to work on her papers for this new status when she was given a GPS anklet and told that she would be deported on September 5th, separated from her children and her community. So she made the decision to seek sanctuary, and I personally, in the congregation of Forest Hill Church Presbyterian, has been transformed by this gracious and brave and determined woman. Some have asked me about, is the church breaking the law, harboring a fugitive? Frankly, we are not breaking the law to offer someone sanctuary. The church and religious institutions have been offering sanctuary for individuals who are at threat for centuries. ICE actually recognizes the special status of churches, schools, and hospitals, at least for the time being. While there is no law protecting churches, only a memo that shapes that policy, which could be taken away at any moment with another memo, or from an order from a higher up the chain of command to take someone like Leonore into custody. Actually, one of the reasons that we were so open to welcoming Lenore at Forest Hill Church was to give Leonore time to complete her application for the UVC. But even if we agreed for the moment that the church broke a law, I would say that it was against the law to hide runaway slaves. It was against the law to hide Jews in Germany. It was against the law what freedom riders did and voter right organizers did and Rosa Parks did and counter sit-ins did. All of those were against the law in some shape or manner. And I would argue that indeed some forms of civil disobedience may be called for at times. And I would also argue that every social movement for progress in our nation, from abolition to child labor laws to breaking Jim Crow to LGBT rights, was started because someone stood up to the law and said it was unjust. Now, Leonore is a lawbreaker. The simple act of being in the United States illegally is not by itself a crime. It is not a felony. Rather, it is a civil violation that puts the individual at risk for deportation, but not necessarily criminal prosecution. I say that, I'm feeling a little nervous talking in front of lawyers, your language, but I just found that on, I looked it up on the internet. How can I be wrong with this, right? I did find out in 2012, Supreme Court case, Arizona versus the United States, the majority opinion found that, quote, as a general rule, it is not a crime for a removable alien to remain present in the United States. It is true that Leonore entered this country in a manner not following standard procedure. But for one who is young, 15 years old, in danger, without the resources of an attorney or support, and how does she get to Mexico City to the consulate? I mean, all these sort of practical things do count. All the more reason for her to be given her due process to appeal for a stay of deportation. Lenore is not a rapist or a gang member. She did not bring drugs, nor is she a criminal. And so to treat her as such, in my mind, is a crime. So in terms of law, I believe the law is on Lenore's side. Give her her due process according to federal guidelines and laws. In terms of theology, you were probably waiting for me to start there. Well, Jesus is very clear in Matthew 25, whatever you do to the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you did to me, and he counts strangers and aliens among that list. And in the Hebrew scripture, the Jews are told to treat foreigners as citizens among them. Look it up, Leviticus 19:34. Any immigrant who lives with you must be treated as if you were as if they were one of your citizens. You must love them as yourself because you are immigrants in the land of Egypt. Now I understand that doesn't necessarily affect American law, but it sure affects this person of faith and the kind of stand that we take. So where law and ethics are undermined by ignorance, fear, and hate, we are in very deep trouble.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. And note to self, never follow a pastor.
Oh, go get him, Mike. Come on.
Can I just say what he said? That's pretty good. The idea of people seeking sanctuary in church is ancient. I mean, has anybody seen the great movie Hunchback of Notre Dame? Can attest? Remember, there's a great scene with the hunchback, sanctuary. We actually have two in our area. In addition to Leonore, there's a woman named Laura who probably inspired by her predecessor, took a sanctuary in church in Mentor, and she's still there, and her children are with her. Her case was a little different. She was just fearing what would happen if she went to ICE. She had gotten a traffic ticket, and she had a hearing coming up, but she was just so afraid to go to that hearing because of ICE's tendency to pick people up at the hearings in Painesville. So she went into the church, and she remains there. And I know that there are others in Ohio and others around the country. And I guess the big question is, where is this going to end? And hopefully it'll end at some point with some reasonable rewriting of our immigration laws so that these things are taken care of and people are treated more fairly. I have a story coming out in the Plain Dealer. If my editor was here, he would be screaming, when? Working on it now. With updated figures from ICE. I've been trying to get figures from them for months with no success. And if you call ICE for information, you might as well talk to this podium because you get nothing. So my FOIA requests never went answered, but then one day I realized that the figures I've been asking for 6 months are on their website. And those figures show that the number of arrests have spiked this year. They're higher this year than they have been in the last 3 years. And on the website, they actually brag. It's very strange. They brag about the number of arrests that have taken place since January 20th. They are very proud of it, that they're arresting as many people as they can. The number of deportations of people actually leaving is also up for our area, which covers Michigan and Ohio. It's up from last year. It's down slightly nationally, but up in some places. So before I was a journalist, when I was back in college, even though I was working for a newspaper, I was considering a career in psychology. And I had a wonderful teacher who said that if you remember one thing about working with your clients, your patients, he said it's this. They'll come to you with a problem, and you talk to them and ask them one question. And that question is, how will this end? And I thought about that, and then that fits almost everything. And it fits the immigration issue. It's like, how will this end? At some point in the future, if 10 million or so illegal immigrants are forced out of the country, how will that end? How will that ultimately affect the United States and all of its individuals? My newspaper stories on Cleveland.com, our affiliate, generate a lot of comments. If any of you noticed, we had 1,500 comments to one of my stories, and 1,499 of them read something like, they're illegal, what part of illegal don't you understand, get out of our country, take your kids with you, take your husband with you, things like that. So I as a reporter, I try desperately to maintain my journalistic integrity and be fair and balanced on my phone. But I try very hard. But after a while, after reading these 1,500 emails, 1,500 not emails, comments, I finally had to respond to one who was particularly vicious. And my response was this. I said, so a man who's lived in this country for 15 years and worked a job that no one else wants, and married a woman and had 4 children, actually had 3 children and adopted one who needed a home. Worked so hard, paid taxes year after year, never committed a crime, bought a house finally, and the children are in school, they're happy. So this man is now being deported. He will may never see his children again. His wife may lose her house, putting them all on the welfare rolls. The children will grow up without a father, and they will face very hard times in addition to the ridicule that they're facing. And I said, and this makes you happy. And I ended my comment by saying, you really need to examine your soul to figure out why this person's pain makes you happy. Because it's a very sad situation. He didn't respond to that. It's just something I'd like to say. I remember I mentioned that I did cover immigration back in the 90s. And for reasons of escape, I stopped. I got moved to other beats, as I recall. I recall one incident when I was talking to a minister, I believe it was Canton, and we were talking about immigration. And while we were there, the phone rang, and he picked up the phone, and he looked very sad. And he just didn't say much. He just said, I understand. I'll call your husband, and good luck. And he hung up. And then he just stared at the phone for a few minutes. And I said, what was that? He said, that was a friend of mine, one of our people in our church, who is an undocumented person. And she is sitting in a traffic light. Someone hit her car from behind and has disabled her car. So she's waiting for the police. And she now realizes that her life is over. That as soon as that officer comes and asks for her license and determines that she has her license and then determines that she's here legally, that will start the process for her deportation. And it just got me thinking that this whole class of people who live with this sort of Damocles over their head, that the slightest thing could just destroy their lives. A woman named Beatrice in Gainesville that I actually ended up visiting in Mexico was driving home on I-90, and there was a police officer pulled over on the side of it, pulled over another car. And she tried to get over in the left lane to give him clearance, but didn't quite get over far enough. And this young, very new, very green, eager beaver state trooper took off after her and pulled her over. And that set into motion her deportation. And once again, as I've tried to point out in the story, 1 second, everything's fine. She's married, 4 kids, has a job, has a husband, kids are doing great in school, she's happy. 1 second later, she's on her way to Mexico. She was put in jail and deported within, I think, 10 days. And when I went to see her in Mexico, when I went to see her with another guy for another story, it struck me that she was very nervous. And I said, "Why are you nervous, Beatrice?" And she said, "Because I hate to think of the comments that people are going to say about me in this story." And I said, "You can't worry about the commenters. I mean, you're in a country by yourself. You have no money, no friends, no family. You're worried about what some guy living in his parents' basement is going to write about you." But it just shows that these people are very sensitive, and they do read the comments. And I don't know. I've often felt that we should do a lot more about that, about restricting those comments, but I'm in the minority. The other thing I noticed is that when I started doing immigration again earlier this year, we started with one that I thought was a really horrible story. And it was Jesus Lara Lopez. And he lived in the town of Willard, which you've never heard of. It's south of Norwalk, some of you may have heard of, an agricultural town. And he was the guy I mentioned, and he had a wife and kids and living a good life. And I felt so bad when I did that story, because, geez, here's this guy, and he's lived a good life, and now he's going to be taken away. And I thought, it doesn't get any worse than that. Well, that was the worst thing I could have said, because just a few weeks later, Beatrice, the woman I mentioned, was deported. And she left the family, and she was sent in the way to Laredo, which is the staging place. And at the same time, a guy named Francisco Narciso was deported and sent to Laredo, Mexico. He was kidnapped. He was held for 5 days. His long-suffering wife was asked to send money for a ransom. She got the money together, sent it, and they said, "That's not enough, we want more." So she sent more, and she had to ask friends and neighbors for money. And then when they got that, they said, "That's not enough, we want more." So she sent more and said, "I can't get any more, that's it." So after 5 days of being beaten and threatened and tortured, they let this guy go. And amazingly enough, he was willing to talk to me. So I went to Mexico and interviewed him in private. So I thought, okay, that's the worst. It can't possibly get any worse than that. And it did. Another guy, about 3 weeks later, Pedro Hernandez Ramirez, was picked up. Pedro has been in the country about 16 years. And he married a woman with a son who was in a wheelchair. He's mentally retarded, and he has a muscular dystrophy. And in very bad shape. And this guy, for 14 years, cared for him, washed him, bathed him, fed him, picked him up, moved him around. And when I saw the two of them together, it was heartbreaking, because the kids loved this guy. Loved him so much. And he was deported. And again, in all these cases, these people, they were deported not because they were criminals, drug dealers, or murderers or anything. It's because they were driving without a license. That was the case that got them deported. That's it, driving without a license, and they've been in the country legally. So this guy is Pedro's wife, who has physical problems herself, is left with this kid that she doesn't know what to do with. And the last time I talked to her, I mean, she was in very bad shape, and she said that she's almost at the point where she's going to have to go to an institution. She fears he's not going to thrive because he's had this attention for so long. The other thing is, when he's in an institution, who's going to pay for that? He needs 24-hour care. It takes 3 people to move him according to the federal regulations. So a guy who was taking care of him free for 14 years is gone, and now he's going to be put in a place where it's going to cost a fortune to keep him alive. So once again, you ask yourself, how is this benefiting him? And again, I thought that's got to be the worst. And then today's paper about another woman who has a 6-year-old daughter in a wheelchair who needs the same kind of help, and she's being reported to Nuevo Laredo. And when I spoke to her in her jail on Sunday night, she was just crying and so upset that she was afraid she was going to be killed when she got to Nuevo Laredo or taken prisoner, all that. So I just look at all these things, and the thing I don't say to myself anymore is that's got to be the worst story, because I know now that that's an invitation to some cosmic balance to show me, oh yeah, we can make it worse. I continue to look for answers, and because there's got to be one. There's got to be a way to solve this that is good for everyone. The one thing I did learn from the statistics that ICE admitted, that ICE talked about, is that the number of people coming over the border from Mexico is down. It's way, way down. It's almost, I can't say non-existent, but there are very few people crossing the border. So it kind of worked, something worked. But what needs to be done now is to decide what to do with the rest of them, with those who are here, with things like DACA, to at least give a pathway to citizenship to the young people who are taken here, against their will. I mean, they probably would like to come, but they're taken here by their parents or else, otherwise, to make them citizens. So I would just hope that at some point we put aside this petty rhetoric and politics and sit down and think of a way to make this situation work that doesn't have these horrible repercussions that we're all seeing. So, thank you.
Who's ready to step forward with the first question for our panelists? I'll throw one in. Michael, you talked a little bit about the comments that you get from people online.
Yes.
So I'm curious from you, Pastor Lentz, when you hear from people in your community or outside of your community, what reactions do you get from people?
Well, it's wonderful to see Carol Rowe and Mike Unger here, who are part of the City Council of Cleveland Heights. And the church itself has had nothing but support. And from the mayor and the police department, they're very clear that they will help protect our property. And if there are any characters wandering around, call them and they'll be right there. So I'll answer your question in the context of community support. In terms of membership of the church, I have not received one negative email or letter or phone call. And if you know anything about Forest Hill Church, those are not shy and retiring types. So I would hear about it if they didn't like it. So I'm counting that as a good thing. Unfortunately, folks who are not, as far as I know, certainly not part of the Forest Hill community and other faith communities and from our city government, we've received some pretty hateful comments recently. There was someone who invited a vigilante group to come and to take Lenore, to break into the church, seize her, and turn her over to ICE. Honestly, I didn't take that totally seriously. On the other hand, you can't mess with that. And so we immediately called the chief of police, and she was right on it, and asked for all the details and sent police protection down to our property. So, oh yeah, we've received it. I've been called names and titles. I've been called an antichrist. I mean, and once you get called an antichrist, what's worse than that, right? Anything else fails. Especially if I'm a pastor. So, question my faith, question my understanding of the Bible, question, they'll drop the verse where, hand to Caesar's what is Caesar's, and then to God what is God's. And I'm like, yeah, but can't you see that really what's at stake in that passage is that everything belongs to God, so act like it, right? And even a passage in Paul's letter about, respect the Roman authority. Well, yeah, when you're a minuscule sect in the midst of imperial Rome, that's a different kind of attitude than when you are part of the imperium. And so, we've received lots of comments. But generally speaking, people have been supportive. The outpouring of money and time has been outstanding.
I'm curious, between covering immigration in the 90s and covering it now, what are the biggest changes that you've seen in this issue?
Well, there seems to be a new zeal to report people. In the last year, I mean, even under Obama, they were reporting people, although there were more criminals being reported than people who were just here. The most striking thing that occurred to me in the 90s, when I was covering it then, I called the federal Washington headquarters of immigration at the time to ask for, because I was doing a particular story, and I said, what does it take to get you to change your mind about deporting someone? And she said, well, the number one reason that we would change our mind about deporting people would be a newspaper story or a TV story. He said, we don't want bad publicity. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. That's ridiculous. I mean, that's one of the big reasons that you let somebody stay. And I said, well, yeah. Today, I think the opposite is true. I don't think the newspaper story displays it in any way. But I was just shocked. And then I think that was one of the reasons I stopped doing it, because I couldn't never longer turn down anyone who wanted the story. And they came in and said, you're my last hope. It's like, you're right. And I couldn't do it wrong. So, but that's the biggest change.
Do we have a question back here?
Yeah. Making the assumption that illegal entry to this country is against the law, and also understanding that these stories of some people have been here for decades illegally. How would you change the law to allow certain people to stay, while at the same time upholding the statute and upholding our immigration laws? It just doesn't give a carte blanche for everybody to come in. And I understand there's very much we're a country of immigrants and all that kind of stuff, but the fact is it is on the law that you have to go through a certain process to gain access. But how would you change the law to allow these things?
That's a really good question, and I thank you for it. I'm sorry you missed the presentations where we spoke specifically to that. And just to remind you that living in the country illegally is not a felon. It's a civil crime. And actually, in 2012, the Supreme Court versus the state of Arizona made very clearly that it's not actually illegal remaining in this country, even though you didn't come through the process. And so my comments would be twofold in response respectfully. There is a process. I remember one of the comments we got was from a young woman who said, well, I and my parents came through the legal way, and it's unfair for Leonore to come in illegally. And, I understand those words, but just think of that context. She had parents. They had time and money and an attorney and resources and access to start that process. Lenore, as the story, and it's true, she was 15, her mom leaves, she's alone, she's in the midst of drug cartel country, and so her process, it's just not that easy. So just remember that context. Secondly, and Mike, I think you've got some really good suggestions. And I'm not a politician, so I'm sure that this needs refinement, but just generally. I mean, first and foremost, we make sure the dreamers stay. Because they were brought into this country, not because they chose to, they came with their parents, and this is their country, and I think we've got to have access to them. I think the temporary workers is an area that we need to work on. I'll let Mike comment on his suggestion because I'm footnoting him. But I think that's something that this, seasonal kind of crossing, I think has to be dealt with. And I think for the 9, 10, 11 million people that are living here lawfully, meaning they haven't broken any laws other than crossing over the border, we're going to describe it as such, there needs to be some sort of process of prioritization where folks who are felons, absolutely, ICE has its duties. I think we can argue for that a nation has the right to watch its borders, but I think we've got to find a way to at least give undocumented immigrants who are here in this country their right of appeal. And if you would have heard the opening remarks, that's exactly what the situation with Lenore is. She's got a legal appeal, a due process right that ICE is ignoring and blocking and not allowing her the process of appealing for a U visa, which is her right, and secondly, applying for a state of deportation. Mike, what do you feel on it?
Pretty much said it all, yeah.
Well, tell more about the workers piece, because I thought that was interesting.
One of the main reasons a lot of people come here is for jobs. It's hard to get a job that pays decently in Mexico, so they will come here, get a job, and send the money back home. Many of them don't really want to stay here. They would rather just go back and forth, but that's impossible. It's not very difficult. So I'm not a politician. I'm a reporter. My job is to say what's happening. But I would think that politicians can get it together to figure out a way to make this work, including the seasonal workers. Let them come in. Let them make sure that they're aware that if they go home, they're going to be able to come back. I mean, that would eliminate a lot of this problem right off the bat. And also, it's very difficult for a person from Mexico who's poor to emigrate to the United States. If you're from France, hey, come on over. It's easy in certain other countries. But if you're from a poor country like Mexico or Central America, it's very difficult. I think that's where the fix needs to be in place. And of course, we also have to take care of those who are already here, giving them some kind of pathways to citizenship.
Is there, right there.
As lawyers, we are trained to try to understand and appreciate the opposing view, whether it's in a litigation context or the other side of a business deal. We try to understand what's driving our adversary, the other side. I, as Pastor Lynn pointed out, I live in Cleveland Heights. I sort of live in a bubble. Like, I don't know these people that you both have had contact with, in particular, the dealer reporter has had contact with, who see things in a completely different and, in my view, very, very odd, difficult to understand way. Have you had a chance, as a result of that dialogue, have you had a chance to come to better appreciate and understand what is really motivating them? What's really going on with those who think that what you just got through describing, and you've described very beautifully in your articles, think that what's going on that causes them to think that it's okay to treat human beings that way? I mean, that's the bottom line. And John, Pastor Lentz can obviously invoke the Bible in far more beautiful, articulate ways than I ever could, but just sort of fundamentally, reality check. What's going on? There are people who have some very firmly held views that, in my view, defy logic, but that doesn't mean that there isn't there isn't a basis for those views. And I have no appreciation for them because, again, I really don't know a whole lot of people like that.
Thank you, Mike.
When my grandparents came here from Italy, they settled in Philadelphia, and their counterparts settled all over New York, all over. But when they came in, they were now the new bottom of the barrel, right? Before then, it was the Irish who were the bottom of the barrel. And as new barrel bottoms come up, those above them get floated up. And I think today, the immigrants have become the new bottom. And there are people who are just a little bit above that who feel better because now they've got somebody to look down. And I hate to say it, but I honestly feel like there's this almost childish thing where like, ooh, I'm better than you. And there's a distrust because they speak a different language. They look different. They're a little darker than we are. And I think that there's just this feeling of they're not as good as we are. And they'll never say that. But if you read between the lines of many of the comments that are under my stories, you kind of get that feeling like there's well, I made it. And I love the comment that I often get is, my great-grandparents came over here and they didn't do it illegally. It's like, well, all you do is sign your name for it. It's a lot more complex than that. So I think that there's that feeling that it's just a way to feel better about yourself by putting someone else down. It's sad.
I would add, that's a great question, and I try to pose that to myself anytime when I go in the pulpit and realize there will be people who listen to me who may not agree. And so I have a great desire to hear and understand. I think the way I would counter my own argument is that nations have the right to control their borders. B, there's a process for coming into the country that we can play with, but essentially there is a way for people to legally come to the country. Why not follow it? 3, I think this is stretching the data, but I think there's probably data to at least argue that undocumented immigrants may impact jobs for Americans. I think that there's an argument I've heard that they take social services, and so if an undocumented immigrant comes in and hurts her or himself, they go to the hospital, who pays for that, right? So I think there's in some sense an economic argument that could be made. I think you have to close, and I don't even mind this in a judgmental, I'm trying to be descriptive, help me with words. I was going to say, I think you have to close your mind to anecdotal stories, anecdotes that we've been sharing that are actually more common than others. And I do think in this time of partisanship that has been whipped up, that when our policy is framed by language and rhetoric that talks about, fear and the other and their rapists and drugs and gangs and criminals. Wow. I mean, if that's what you hear, so I think there is a kind of, my worldview, and I could be off. I'm the first to say it. My worldview is just in my own faith tradition, teaches me to expand hospitality rather than to narrow it. That truth is something that is continually open to question and expansive rather than we got to dig it down to one little inch and we got to be narrow. So, okay, now that's my perspective. But to answer your question, I think those are 4 or 5 reasons why people would say, Pastor Lynch, you're full of it. Just follow the law and let's get on with it.
There's another question over here.
Yeah, John, you mentioned earlier, you was talking about the law being, some laws are just unjust in reference to civil rights laws and the reactions to that. And I'm curious whether you think that the response to the unjust both of you, but you think the response to unjust civil rights laws is being replicated with respect to unjust immigration laws, and if you're seeing the same reaction to that unjust, and if not, why not?
Well, I always want to be really careful about speaking, from a perspective that was not a victim of the civil rights laws in the 50s, 60s, long before. I mean, in the history of our country, frankly, in immigration law. So I want to be really careful about that. And also, I don't think history repeats itself, but I think it was Mark Twain who said, but it sure does rhyme. And I think that's a really good quotation. So I think we're in a rhyming moment. As I understand, I mean, I think what impartially drove Dr. King, for instance, was trying to hold this nation accountable to its foundational documents and to its laws, to the politics. And when that doesn't work, when you can't change the law through the law or by political means, I do think there comes a time when we have to stand up and say, that ain't right. I'm willing to suffer the consequences for it. And so I would say, with all humility, that yeah, I think the seasons are rhyming. I think history is rhyming. And I think what we're seeing in terms of the reaction to what's happening around this immigration is a continuation of what we still haven't figured out about issues of race in this country.
I think we have time for just one more question over here.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I'm responding somewhat to Mike Unger's question. Mike and I are colleagues on Cleveland Heights City Council, and I also live in the bubble of Cleveland Heights, obviously. But a lot of the people who are opposite view are my family members. And I'm still struggling with exactly how do we communicate better with those individuals, because my family members are Christian people who go to church and think that this is against the law, and it's an economic issue too. So I don't know how we do that, but I think we really need to work at it. Thank you.
Can I make a quick jump and then you can have the final word? I think that's well phrased. I mean, Forrestal Church is not all progressive liberals. We have folks on both sides and people who voted for all the candidates. And so I think one of the weaknesses, the weakness of my stance about you can't just base things on anecdote is also the strongest when you get to personal. It's when you know Landon. And folks who would disagree with me politically on almost everything, they're the ones who are coming and spending the nights with Landor and serving her dinner and getting to know her, and their minds have been changed. There was a case of a small town, I forget where, in the heartland, where very supportive of President Trump and the policies, but when ICE came to take away a person who ran the local store, he was like, what? You mean take away, huh? I forget his name, but this gentleman, then it was like, oh, well, maybe we need to broaden our mind a little bit. So I think there's nothing like telling stories, getting them engaged to meet with immigrant populations, and listening to, I think, challenge the storyline. And we live in a bubble, but so does everybody, and Cleveland Heights is a damn nice bubble. Thank you.
Michael gets the last word.
I think that at some point in the future, I don't know how many years from now, we're going to look back at this time and just kind of smack ourselves in the head and say, why was this so difficult to do?
Yes.
I think that there's going to be a time of reckoning where people are going to come to their senses and think of a logical way to do this. And I just look for that time. And in terms of talking to your family members, I mean, tell me about it. If you think of a way, let me know. I've given up, I just don't talk to anybody. Just very simple.
Well, when we were I'm sorry, I used to be the last word, but I'm taking the last word. But I was at the table with my father-in-law in Heartland, Minnesota, who sees things very differently. And around the dinner table, he and his relatives were saying, well, those Mexican immigrants are the source of the opioid crisis. I said, John, no. Let's at least separate and get real that we're talking about two very, and I'm a good pastor. It's like very complicated issues, and yes, and I love you, Dad, and all this stuff. At least we've got to be talking about the real particular issues. And I think they get all lumped together. And so I think if you were people you disagree with, respectfully, you got to disagree with them. And I think you got to call them out on facts. My job is not to change minds, it's to be faithful to that which I believe is true. And we'll take the consequences. But I think you've got to speak back, and you've got to come up with the data. We got to get educated, and you've got to tell stories. You've got to get people interacting, the true victims of these stories.
Thank you both so much for being here. We probably have another several-hour conversation, so please join me in thanking our panelists.
If I could invite you to save the date, January 9th, which is the second Tuesday of the month, we'll have our next Hot Talk series right back here at the Bar Association. So we hope you'll join us for that. Thank you again for coming.
Thank you.